So Games Workshop really hasn't gone easy on Tyranids in recent days. Let's talk about the Arks of Omen changes for them and where that leaves the faction now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids once more, this time doing a video focusing on the fate of the faction in Arks of Omen. I'd say arguably the army that got the single biggest hits in the balanced data slate and points changes. Tyranids were certainly doing well enough in the game beforehand. Ever since their codex came out, they've been doing pretty spectacularly well, all despite two successive rounds of rather brutal nerfs. I have a feeling that Games Workshop's knocked them decently off the top spots, though how far they fall I think is maybe a bit more up for debate at this point. Let's talk about the changes that they've made, how much the points impacts are going to take, talk through their secondary objectives, and where that might overall leave the bugs in terms of strong lists in Warhammer right now. So first up, we have the balanced data slate changes for the Tyranids. Broadly speaking, there were three of them: a nerf to the overrun stratagem, the spore mine spawning nerf, and the change so that flyers have to start off the board. The overrun change was a stratagem that I was expecting them to alter. It's the one command point stratagem that was basically used to make winged hive tyrants really annoying to deal with. You'd have them behind tyrant guard, they'd jump out 17 inches with their adrenal glands, and then they'd use overrun once they'd killed their thing to move 17 inches back behind those tyrant guard and not be shot anymore. I feel like that probably wasn't the intended purpose of the stratagem. If it's one that's aimed for surging towards the enemy, perhaps it is still useful, but far more niche. If you've killed the enemy and getting a normal move afterwards might get you to an objective or get you safe, then all well and good, but you're not going to be able to do it to ping a hive tyrant back and forth with impunity. I feel like that is going to change the hive tyrant in a way that it might be behind tyrant guard, jump out and smash something dead. But then unless the terrain's very favourable, you're probably going to be at a focal point for all the enemies shooting in return. Definitely a nerf to the winged tyrant, might make the foot one a bit more tempting by comparison. Next up, we've got the change to spore mines, which I thought was also rather brutal. The units that spawn them, such as the Spore Assist, Biovores and Harpies, now always pay reinforcement points if they want to do so, rather than say using the Harpy bombs or the Biovores direct mortal wound attack. Basically, the option to do this on all of these units I would now rate as unusably bad. Previously, it was really quite a nice area denial tool. You'd throw out a whole bunch of spore mines in an area where your opponent might want to move, and you could have made them annoying to just gun down by putting them behind terrain or on an objective that didn't have good lines of sight to it. When they were basically free and included in the unit's price, that was a great move, but if they're costing 10 points per mine beyond that, you might well be spending 60 points in theory for a 3 model Biovore unit to spawn out a bunch of mines, and I suspect that that would be kind of borderline worth even if they were just causing one direct mortal wound on the enemy anyway, let alone the chance they might just be guns down by some trivial anti-infantry fire if the enemy gets line of sight on them. Overall, it's a big nerf to the Biovores, Harpies and Spore Assist. Means that this choice just isn't really something that you're going to want to use in any sort of competitive game in my opinion, and overall it is a big nerf to Tyranid lists. Biovores and Harpies were really quite common staples, and Spore Assists were usable enough as well. Finally, for the main changes on the balanced data slate for the Tyranids, the flyer nerf also bites hard as well. Harpies were certainly a very common choice, great shooting, a decent bomb attack, and the option for melee, spawning mines, and the options for things like melee and synaptic upgrades if it made sense. These guys being forced to start in strategic reserve off the board really ruins their whole bombing ability thing. It means that if you come in from strategic reserve turn 2, then you're not going to be bombing anything then. You can't even spawn spore mines instead now, not unless you pay the reinforcement points, and you're not going to be able to use the direct bomb attack till turn 3, which I think is just a little bit late for impacting the game meaningfully if you're going to be spending the points on one. As if that weren't enough as well, Games Workshop also made their Venom cannons cost even more. I feel like between all those changes, Harpies just aren't going to get played now, and people are going to invest the points in something else. Then, beyond the specific changes that affect Tyranids on the balanced data slates, there's really quite a lot of stuff that's changed in Arks of Omen in general. Armour of Contempt being gone has been balanced out by points changes for a bunch of armies, but several armies like Chaos Space Marines and Sisters didn't really get that much as a counterbalance for that, and in general it means that AP-1 weapons across the board are going to be far more usable wherever they crop up in the army. Certainly anything that was running them already, maybe things like big units of Termagants with a Tervigon perhaps, but it might make choices like the Morlock with mass AP-1 attacks just a little bit more tempting. The Arks of Omen attachment is a little bit more freeing in terms of what units that you filled. Could be pretty handy if, say, you wanted to spam loads of heavy support bugs like Exocrines or Carnifexes, for example. And I feel like having 4 HQ choices isn't the worst either, as a fair few of the Tyranid's strongest units are there. I do quite like the way as well that you'd be able to get a second Hive Tyrant for just 1 command point extra as well, It means that you could run a foot one and a winged one if you wanted, or 2 foot ones, and you wouldn't be paying as much as you would have been if you'd taken a second patrol as a tax. 3 strategic reserve doesn't hurt either. That could help out with a couple of units that want close range shooting delivery. Things like Pyrovores, I think, would be a good choice for that. Maybe a unit of 3 of them turning up at a strategic reserve and flaming whatever they can get their moors on. I feel like previously they were a bit less tempting, as you might have wanted to get them a Tyrannocyte or something, which would cost loads more. Strategic reserve could be a little bit more usable for armies that want to take the +1 to charge adaptive ability. I guess that way you'd be getting an 8-inch charge out of that. Otherwise, no allied Genestealer cults isn't the best thing in the world. I guess in general you probably didn't want to usually give up the synaptic imperatives and things, but a Battle Brothers option would have been quite nice if Games Workshop had chosen to go that way. I guess maybe the Genestealer cults might be just a little bit unreliable to rely on once you actually reveal that Ascension means that their entire planet gets eaten, at least for those that aren't under direct psychic sway of a Patriarch or something. Still a bit sad from going from one shaky ally to none though, even if it wasn't perhaps the most optimal thing in the world. Finally, in a core rules change, certain weapons got a bit of a buff. The Reaper of Blisterax, which was great already, is one of them. As well as cutting through things like ignore wounds and feel no pain, it now gets to ignore -1 damage mechanics as well, and they're really quite common in 40k. With a damage 3 weapon like that, that's pretty useful. It'll be far more effective at chewing through things like Space Marine Dreadnoughts, or Imperial Knight Armigers, or Death Guard. Overall, a few things that help out certain Tyranid units here though. Though obviously compared with the specific faction changes and the points nerfed to their units, the overall picture isn't exactly great. Talking of which, let's talk through the points changes that they've got. First up we have the troops and elite units. Tyranid Warriors base cost is unchanged, but a bunch of their gear got nerfed. In particular, Games Workshop nerfed Bone Swords and the Death Spitters, which were the 2 perhaps most common things that they'd usually pick up. Bone Swords now 5 points for 1 and 10 points for 2, if you do want that nice -2 AP and damage 2 attacks in combat. With that change, 2 Bone Swords is now basically never worth it. The Lash Whip and Bone Sword might be at 5 points, you do get to reroll hit rolls of 1 with that. I think it would now probably be competing most against the Rending Claws. Those ones give you strength 6, AP -4 and damage 1. So better AP, but not quite so good at killing Space Marines and things. Otherwise, the Barb Strangler is now +10 points, whereas the Venom Cannon remains at +5. I don't know why that one was the one that went up. I think I saw more people taking the Venom Cannon over that by a long way. I'd still say the Venom Cannon is probably the way to go, and now it's probably auto-include versus the other guns. Speaking of which, the Death Spitter, which was the most common shooting loadout, went up a bit. That one's strength 5 and AP -2. I feel like now it competes quite closely with the Devourer. That's the 5-shot one at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Maybe again moderately balanced between the two. I feel like a fair few people will just be taking the Devourers just to save the points. Overall, a fairly heavy nerf for the unit, I think. I probably wouldn't want to be trying to run them at greater than 35 points. So I think my first upgrade will be Venom Cannons, and then you could think about adding Bone Sword and Lash Whips, or maybe upgrading to a Death Spitter if you fancied, or just keeping them cheap and just taking them for the Synapse and the Synaptic Imperative that they bring. For the other units, Venom Thropes went up to 40 points, a 14% nerf. I think they're still usable enough to keep a chunk of your army with a -1 to hit. Obviously less efficient now that it costs 120 points rather than 105 though. The Zone Thropes are 70 points now, the single greatest nerf out of any of the points cost changes. That's up a massive 40% extra. Though even at this level, I think I'd still be very tempted to take one unit along. They are the unit that unlocks the Psychic Protection Synaptic Imperative with the invul saves. I think I'd be most tempted to run exactly one unit of these now and just take 3. A whole load less efficient for their mortal wounds, though they still will deal some reliable damage, but I think you still want them for the turn of invul saves, which I think will add up to be enough value between that and their unit profile across the army. Definitely not worth taking more than one unit though. Otherwise, the Tyrant Guard are 45 points now, so a medium-sized nerf to them. Again, I'd probably say still worth it to cover a Tyrant. They are some of the biggest and most efficient models in the army, whether walking or in the air. Again though, that entire combo takes a hit. Otherwise, for the HQ choices, I think perhaps getting away lightly are the Neurothropes. They're 110 points plus 10 and are still very efficient for the cost, I think. Really quite nice Nid Psychic casting, plus the option to get other units casting on a 3d6 as well. Old One Eye goes up for some reason to 250 points. Seems pretty unnecessary to me, I don't know why they nerfed him. The Turvigon goes up a bit to 235 points, a 20 points nerf that one, or around about 10%. Overall, I feel like this one's maybe a little bit less bad than it looks. If you take your Turvigon, I think that most people would generally want to take along a big unit of 30 Termagants as well with the Flesh Borers, layer some defensive buffs on those, and then make them respawn with the Turvigon spawning abilities. If you did take them as basically a auto-include alongside the Turvigon, then that overall formation's only taken a 5% nerf. I think overall Turvigon plus Gaunts is still viable. Doesn't hurt that the Termagants will also be getting a bit better against the Space Marines and things with their AP -1. The Winged Hive Tyrant's gone up again, and now it really is looking like a bit of a premier choice. 230 points base, plus that overrun nerf and more expensive Tyrant Guard really do hit this guy fairly hard. As mentioned earlier, I think that this guy will be in a lot more stiff competition with the Tyrant on foot. He now is very significantly cheaper, plus tougher, and bears a massive gun, potentially a relic. Moving on to the other changes throughout the codex, Raveners got kinda destroyed a bit. They went up to 45 points and a massive 28% nerf there. I think this one just is out and out brutal, to be honest. They were a very efficient unit all around, but now they're probably inferior to warriors, and they just lose a whole load of ground against other units in the codex in general. I suspect that we'll be seeing a whole ton less of them. The Trigon goes up 15 points to 160. Again, I'd say that this falls into the pretty unnecessary category. They were kind of fine where they were, I thought. Not really all that commonly played in top tournament lists compared with some. The heavy support section doesn't really catch a break either. Carnifexes are up to 125 points now. Looking fairly mediocre, and I'd say that compared with them, the Screamer Killers are looking a lot more tempting now. I think they'd probably be the stock go-to Carnifex, even despite the heavy Venom cannon being very good. The Tyrannifex goes up 15 points, a 9% nerf to 185 points base. Again, a bit more mediocre, though still probably usable, I guess. Comparatively, I feel like it's probably raised the value of the Exocrine in comparison. I felt like the two were at least fairly well balanced at the points cost that they were. The Exocrine might well have the edge now with its general purpose strength 8, damage 3 firepower. Lastly, and maybe just to mirror the Tyrant Guard, Games Workshop's put up the Hive Guard to 55 points. If the ones to the Trigon and Old One Eye seemed a bit unnecessary, this one feels an absolute lot unnecessary. They weren't being taken in any sort of competitive list, as they were just very inefficient as a unit, so I don't know if they just put them up by mistake, or just really wanted to double down on punishing the players who bought loads of them when they were really good earlier in 2022. Otherwise, the Harpy remains at 175 points, but the Heavy Venom Cannon's gone up to 30 points each now, so again a fairly sizable nerf to that loadout specifically. Combined with the Flyer nerf and the nerf to its Spore Mine spawning, I feel like people are going to look elsewhere compared with Harpies now, and if you had to pick one of the two guns, I'd be a lot more tempted to take the Stranglethorn Cannons as opposed to the Heavy Venom ones. To be fair, for 175 points, perhaps if you just wanted a deep strike one with the Stranglethorn Cannons and do a bit of shooting turn 2, then go off to be a late game threat, it could be okay. They would get 10 shots at strength 8, AP -2, which isn't nothing. Losing the Alpha Strike ability does sting quite a bit though. Finally, on the table of Synaptic upgrades, the Synaptic Enhancement one has gone up to 15 points rather than 10. That's the one that if you want to upgrade a monster to Synapse. Overall, not really the biggest nerf in the world, that if you wanted it, you probably still want it now. It certainly still seems fine enough for Leviathan lists, where gaining Synapse gains you transhuman physiology on the monsters. Overall, it's a fairly brutal battery of nerfs to Tyranid points cost. We'll talk about where that leaves Tyranids and strong units in just a second. First up though, I just quickly wanted to cover the new objectives and things, the secondary objectives from the Arks of Omen mission pack, and the changes to Tyranids are all nerfs, though maybe don't change things hugely for them perhaps. Arguably the biggest one might be the change to the Psychic Interrogation one from the generic set. That one was really quite a popular one for Tyranid lists, with a whole load of great psychers that cast on high values. It just means that they're very hard to deny. Tyranids won't struggle with the new casting value, I think, but it might just be a little bit more questionable as to whether you can deploy it. Now you need line of sight on characters, could allow enemies a few gamey plays with hiding them. Otherwise, for the specific Tyranid objectives, I didn't feel that these were particularly strong in the first place, to be honest. It seemed like a lot of Tyranid lists tended to use the more generic book ones and just leave these completely on the shelf. Synaptic Insight I think was arguably the weakest. That's the one where you need to get kills with synapse creatures, and it means that you need an army list that's set up in a certain way, and also to have the right sort of targets in your opponent's army. You have a specific tally for this one, with greater wound models getting you more points, and now you need to hit 5 of those points in a turn to get the 3 victory point score, which feels like it's very hard to max, even in a list that's built for it. Overall, a fairly sizable nerf to a fairly bad secondary, I think. Otherwise, there's a small nerf to Cranial Feasting, which was a bit more usable. This is the one where you need to kill characters or unit leaders in melee. You get some victory points for each one of those that you kill. 3 victory points for characters, 1 victory point for a unit leader, and an extra 3 victory points if you manage to farm some command points over the game. This was done if you manage to kill one of the specific targets in melee with a unit with feeder tendrils, so it means that you get a few more victory points there. The nerf is that the feeder tendrils now only give you a +1 to that rather than a +2, so they are a bit worse. Overall, I think it still could be usable enough for certain matchups with melee-focused Tyranids. In general, though, it does compete pretty hard with the Assassinate one, which is just a bit more direct and kill characters at range or melee or psychic. Finally, the Spawn Nodes one I think was maybe a little bit hard to achieve. You need to get infantry units up the board to do actions. It isn't undoable, but I feel like it's one of those objectives where it's going to be easy to achieve if the game's going very well for you, and pretty hard if the opponent's doing well and they're killing a bunch of your units. Overall, pretty much just not very good news for Tyranids on this front. I still think that they're going to be pretty heavily reliant on the book objectives and doing things like raising banners, mental interrogation or the warp ritual, and any potential kill ones that you can hoover up. So overall, my assessment would be that Tyranids have really been hit very hard by these changes, though admittedly they started from about as strong a place as you could imagine in 40k at the moment, being a real challenge for a whole ton of armies to overcome. These really are some brutal changes though. Pretty much the majority of strong units and most competitive lists would take some really big points hits, plus the Flyer and Spawn Mine nerfs really hurt things like Harpies and Biovores even more, and the secondary objectives remain a bit of a low point of the faction. Overall, in terms of stronger units to include in lists, this might be some of the main repertoire going forward, I feel. I'd take one unit of Zoanthropes to allow you to trigger the Synaptic Imperative and not more, still probably just about worth it at 210 points. A Turvigon plus a unit of 30 Gaunt still seems fine. I feel like that's going to be pretty tempting and they can be pretty tanky. Venomthropes still seem okay but less standout. Outflanking Pyrovores seem like they could be a lot more usable. I think the Hive Tyrants are both still fine, particularly as spamming them is a bit easy. I feel like maybe we might even see things like double Hive Tyrant on foot walking around with some good guns. They're still going to be kind of obnoxious to deal with the Tyrant Guard even at the higher price, put out a bunch of character protected firepower, and then of course have a massive countercharge threat as well. The Parasite and Mortrex is still a very nice utility piece, and that wasn't touched. You can go jumping around and obsecking objectives with its Warlord trait. And in terms of monsters, I feel like things might actually be a bit more balanced between the various big Tyranids now. Some of the most common picks took some hits. I feel like things like the Morlock, Maliceptor, the Exocrine, and the Screamer Killers all a bit more tempting in comparison. Though most of the old staples in terms of monsters I think still remain playable, just less standout. Finally, hordes and things weren't touched at all. I guess we might see a few more chaff gargoyles and hormigants for obsec. I kind of wonder whether a few people might be experimenting with things like High Fleet Gorgon, where you get the auto wounds on force. Now that a bunch of the other best damage dealers have been taken out, maybe some Hordy type lists with that could be kind of fun. I almost forgot to talk about the Neurothrope as well. He's one of the best and most auto-include HQ choices. He's only got a minor points nerf. I'm sure he'll remain a staple. Overall, I guess after these changes, Tyranids are going to be a lot more mid-tier, potentially even lower mid-tier, though they do have a codex with a ton of options. It'll be interesting to see how they shake out. They've certainly taken some more massive hits, but they did surprise me last time when they took similar points nerfs, if not worse, and still came back strong. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes though. Let me know what you think of the Tyranid nerfs down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below if you'd be interested in helping support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.